The sun began to dip low over the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, casting long, distorted shadows across a landscape that had been transformed into a charnel house. It was 7 o'clock in the evening on June 18, 1815. For 10 grueling hours, the rolling fields of Belgium had absorbed the fury of two of history's greatest military machines. The air was no longer transparent. It was a thick, acrid soup of sulphurous smoke, hanging heavy and stagnant in the damp evening air. The ground, once a lush carpet of tall rye, standing shoulder height to a man, had been trampled into a slick paste of mud, blood, and crushed stalks. To the soldiers of the Anglo-Allied army, clinging desperately to the ridge, the world had narrowed to a terrifying simplicity. The deafening roar of cannon fire, the rhythmic thud of musket balls striking human flesh, and the agonizing thirst that plagued men in the heat of battle. The Duke of Wellington's centre was dangerously thin. Regiments that had started the day with full ranks were now reduced to ragged clusters of survivors, tightening their lines to fill the gaps left by the dead. The British line had held, but it was brittle, stretched to the breaking point like a worn violin string. Across the valley, through the gloom and the drifting smoke, the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte surveyed the carnage. He knew, as all great commanders know, that the battle hung in the balance. The Prussians were arriving on his right flank, threatening to crush his army in a vice. He had one card left to play, one weapon that had never failed him in 20 years of conquest. He ordered the advance of the Imperial Guard. This was not merely a reinforcement, it was a psychological weapon of mass destruction. The Imperial Guard was the elite of the elite, men chosen for their height, their strength, and their fanatical devotion to the Emperor. They had marched through the capitals of Europe, from Madrid to Moscow, and they had never been defeated. As they assembled in the valley below, a terrifying sound began to drift up toward the British lines. It was not the chaotic noise of skirmishing, but a deep, rhythmic percussion that vibrated in the chest. Rum-dum-dum, rum-dum-dum. The pas de charge. The beating of the drums signalled the approach of the immortals. On the British right centre, positioned slightly forward of the main line, stood a brigade that had largely escaped the worst of the day's cavalry charges. Among them was the 52nd, Oxfordshire, Light Infantry. They were a massive unit, over 1,000 men strong, clad in the iconic red coats and the distinctive stovepipe shakos of the light infantry. Unlike the terrified conscripts filling the ranks of other armies, these were veterans of the Peninsular War. They had spent years fighting across Spain and Portugal, honing a discipline that was ironclad. As the light faded, the men of the 52nd peered into the smoke-choked valley. The ground before them, known to history as the Valley of Death, was about to become the stage for the final act of the Napoleonic Wars. The British artillery, sensing the gathering storm, switched their ammunition. The gunners stopped loading solid round shot and began ramming home canister, tin cases filled with musket balls that turned cannons into giant shotguns. The atmosphere on the ridge was suffocating. The smell was a nauseating mixture of wet earth, burnt black powder, horse sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. Yet, amidst the sensory overload, a hush seemed to fall over the British line as the drumming grew louder. Every soldier knew what was coming. The rum-dum-dum was the heartbeat of the French Empire, and it was getting stronger. Then, they appeared. Through the swirling grey smoke, dark shapes began to materialize. First, the tall, imposing silhouettes of bearskin caps, then the dark blue greatcoats, and finally, the glint of thousands of bayonets catching the dying light. The Imperial Guard was advancing in massive columns, a dark tide moving with an eerie, silent determination, ignoring the gaps torn into their ranks by the Allied artillery. They did not run. They marched with a terrifying, inexorable slowness. To the exhausted British infantry waiting on the ridge, it looked as though the earth itself was vomiting forth an unstoppable army. The final crisis of Waterloo had arrived. As the dark mass of the Imperial Guard surged forward, the French assault force began to separate into distinct columns, guided by the undulating terrain and the chaos of the battlefield. While the first great column directed its fury toward the British Guards led by Maitland, a second massive body of troops, composed largely of the chasseurs à pied of the Middle and Old Guard, drifted to their left. This formidable block of veteran soldiers, numbering nearly 2,000 men in the immediate column, began to march diagonally across the front of the British line. Their trajectory took them away from a direct collision with the British centre and instead exposed them to the waiting guns of General Adams' brigade. At the heart of Adams' brigade stood the 52nd Oxfordshire Light Infantry. With over 1,100 bayonets in the ranks, they were the single largest British battalion on the field that day. But numbers alone did not define them. It was their leadership that set them apart. Commanding the regiment was Colonel Sir John Colborne, a man cast from the hardest steel of the military profession. Colborne was a veteran's veteran, a soldier who had learned the grim art of war under the scorching sun of Spain and Portugal. He was known not for flamboyant speeches, but for a cool, almost icy detachment in the face of fire and a tactical mind that operated with the precision of a Swiss watch. From his vantage point on the muddy slope, Colborne watched the French advance with a critical eye. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The smoke was so thick that visibility was reduced to mere yards in some places, creating a claustrophobic fog of war that isolated commanders from their units. The Duke of Wellington, the army's supreme commander, was somewhere to the rear, frantically rallying the crumbling centre, far too occupied to issue specific tactical orders to individual regiments on the periphery. Colborne realised with a dawning clarity that he was entirely on his own. There would be no courier arriving with a folded parchment, no aide-de-camp galloping up with instructions. The fate of his sector rested solely on his judgment. He looked at his men. The 52nd was drawn up in a formation that defied standard British doctrine. Typically, Wellington's infantry fought in a thin red line, 2 ranks deep, to maximise their firepower. But facing the sheer weight of the Imperial Guard, Colborne had arranged his men 4 ranks deep. This was a heavy, dense formation designed not just to shoot, but to absorb shock, a human breakwater built to withstand the tidal wave of the French assault. The men stood silent, their muskets grounded, waiting for the command that would unleash hell. The French column, oblivious to the specific threat on their flank, continued its inexorable march. They were moving with a terrifying discipline, closing the distance to the Allied ridge. Colborne could see the details of their uniforms now. The long blue greatcoats worn over their dress uniforms, the tall bearskin caps that added a foot to their height, making them appear like giants in the gloom. He could see the flash of their officers' swords and hear the guttural roars of "Vive l'Empereur" rising above the din of battle. These were men who believed they were invincible, marching against an enemy they believed was already beaten. But Colborne noticed something else, a geometric flaw in the French advance. By marching diagonally across his front to strike the Allied centre, the French column was exposing its left flank to the 52nd. It was a fleeting tactical opportunity, one that would exist for only a few minutes before the French smashed into the British line and rolled it up from the inside. To exploit it, however, Colborne would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to leave the safety of the defensive line, move his regiment out into the open field, and manoeuvre under the very nose of the enemy. It was a gamble of the highest order. If he moved too early, the French artillery would tear his dense formation to shreds with canister shot. If he moved too late, the Guard would pierce the Allied centre, and the battle would be lost. Moreover, moving a battalion of 1,000 men from a static line into a new position while under fire required a level of drill and discipline that few regiments possessed. One stumble, one moment of panic, and the 52nd would dissolve into a mob. Colborne sat on his horse, his eyes locked on the passing French column. The air around him buzzed with the angry hornet sound of passing musket balls. He watched the French chasseurs pressing forward, their eyes fixed on the ridge ahead, ignoring the red-coated regiment standing silently to their left. They were walking into a trap, but the trap had not yet been sprung. The colonel tightened his grip on the reins. The moment of decision had arrived. He would not wait for Wellington. He would not wait for support. He would take the 52nd into the jaws of the Imperial Guard alone. At precisely 7:15, Sir John Colborne broke the paralysis of the British centre. He did not wait for a signal from the Duke, nor did he consult the brigade commander nearby. With the decisive abruptness that characterised his entire career, he rode to the front of his regiment and roared the command that would alter the course of European history. Right shoulders forward! To the uninitiated, the order might have sounded innocuous, but to the veteran soldiers of the 52nd, it triggered a complex and perilous evolution. Colborne was ordering a wheel, a manoeuvre where the entire battalion, over 1,000 men deep, would pivot on its left flank, like a colossal gate swinging on a hinge. The objective was to swing the regiment out of the Allied line and bring it perpendicular to the advancing French column. It was a movement of breathtaking audacity. By executing this wheel, the 52nd was effectively detaching itself from the safety of the main army and isolating itself in the open field, with its back to the enemy lines and its front facing the flank of the Imperial Guard. The execution of the manoeuvre was a testament to the iron discipline of the British light infantry. Despite the uneven ground, slick with mud and trampled crops, and despite the exhaustion of 10 hours of fighting, the men of the 52nd moved with the precision of a machine. The right side of the line stepped out briskly, covering the ground in long strides, while the left side marked time, acting as the pivot point. Slowly, majestically, the Great Red Wall began to swing out from the ridge. In the centre of this moving formation marched Ensign William Leake. Just 17 years old, Leake was little more than a boy, yet he bore one of the heaviest responsibilities on the battlefield. In his hands, he gripped the heavy pole of the regimental colour, the silken flag that served as the soul of the regiment. To lose the colour was the ultimate disgrace. To carry it was to paint a target on one's own chest. As the 52nd wheeled into the open, Leake and the colour party became the focal point of the formation, a bright splash of silk rising above the dark shakos, signalling to friend and foe alike that the 52nd was on the move. The risk of the manoeuvre was compounded by the fog of war. As the 52nd swung out, they moved directly into the line of fire of their own artillery and the neighbouring British regiments. For a few terrifying moments, they were in as much danger from their friends as from their enemies. Several British officers, seeing a large body of troops moving erratically in the smoke, hesitated, fingers hovering over triggers, unsure if this was a French flanking manoeuvre or a British counter-attack. Colborne, riding aggressively at the front, ignored the potential for friendly fire. His eyes were fixed solely on the French. The French chasseurs, meanwhile, were still tramping forward, their gaze locked on the ridge ahead, seemingly mesmerised by their objective. The noise of their own drums and the roar of the battle masked the sound of the British boots churning the mud to their left. They did not see the red wall detaching itself from the horizon. They did not see the gate swinging shut behind them. As the 52nd completed the wheel, the geometry of the battlefield snapped into a deadly alignment. The British regiment was now positioned perfectly parallel to the left flank of the French column. The French were marching in a deep, narrow formation, designed to punch through a line, not to defend its sides. They presented a target that was impossible to miss. A solid block of men, thousands strong, extending down the slope. The 52nd, by contrast, was arranged in a long, 4-deep line, bringing every single musket to bear on the exposed French flank. Colborne raised his sword. The wheel was complete. The gate had closed across the French line of retreat. The 52nd halted, the men breathless from the exertion, their boots sinking into the soft earth. The noise of the battlefield seemed to recede for a split second as the soldiers brought their muskets up, leveling the heavy barrels toward the dark mass of the Imperial Guard just yards away. The French column, sensing a presence on their flank, began to falter, heads turning in confusion toward the new threat. But it was too late. The trap had been sprung. The distance between the two forces was now less than 60 yards. At this range, the Brown Bess, the British land-pattern musket, ceased to be an inaccurate firearm and became an instrument of terrifying efficiency. The weapon fired a lead ball nearly 3/4 of an inch in diameter, a heavy, soft projectile that flattened on impact, shattering bone and tearing massive exit wounds. When fired in a disciplined volley by a battalion of 1,000 men, it did not merely kill individuals, it swept away entire ranks like a scythe through wheat. Colborne shouted the order to fire. The command rippled down the line, echoed by the captains and sergeants. "Make ready! Present! Fire!" The result was a single, deafening crash that sounded like a thunderclap striking the earth. A sheet of flame erupted from the muzzles of over 1,000 muskets, instantly shrouded in a thick white cloud of black powder smoke. The recoil kicked hard against the shoulders of the British infantrymen, but their eyes were already peering through the gloom to see the effect. The impact on the French column was catastrophic. This was not a skirmish or a probing attack. It was a textbook example of enfilade fire. The British volley slammed into the side of the French formation, tearing through the packed ranks of the Imperial Guard. Because the French were marching in a column, essentially a long, dense rectangle, a single bullet that missed the man on the outer edge would likely hit the man standing next to him, or the man next to him. There were no misses here. The lead balls chewed through the blue greatcoats and bearskin caps, punching through file after file of the French chasseurs. The entire left side of the French column seemed to dissolve. Hundreds of men went down in a split second, their bodies creating a gruesome rampart of dead and wounded that tripped those behind them. The momentum of the French advance, which had been so unstoppable moments before, slammed into a wall of lead. The column shuddered and halted, the rear ranks piling into the confused mass at the front. The rhythmic drumming of the pas de charge stopped abruptly, replaced by the screams of the dying and the frantic shouts of officers trying to restore order. For the French, the situation was a tactical nightmare. They were being attacked from a direction they could not defend. Their muskets were pointing forward, toward the ridge they had been assaulting, but the death was coming from their left. To return fire, the French soldiers would have to stop, turn 90 degrees, and reform their lines. A maneuver that was nearly impossible to execute while under withering fire and packed shoulder to shoulder in a panic-stricken mob. The 52nd did not give them the chance. With the mechanical efficiency born of years of drill, the British soldiers began to reload. They bit the paper cartridges, tasted the bitter gunpowder, poured the powder down the barrels, rammed the balls home, and brought the hammers back to full cock. The process took less than 20 seconds for a trained soldier. Then, the line levelled their muskets again. Crash! A second volley tore into the reeling French mass. The Imperial Guard, the soldiers who had conquered Europe, were helpless. They were trapped in a kill-box of Colborne's making. The psychological shock was as devastating as the physical one. These men were used to seeing enemies run before them. They were not used to being slaughtered without a chance to fight back. The Invincibles were being dismantled, rank by rank. Yet, even in this maelstrom, the discipline of the Guard did not immediately break. These were veterans of 100 battles. Some of the French officers, realizing the desperation of their position, tried to wheel their own men around to face the 52nd. They shouted orders, waving their swords, trying to turn the heavy beast of the column to face its tormentor. But the chaos was absolute. The sheer volume of fire coming from the 52nd was overwhelming, a relentless storm of lead that made organized movement impossible. The ground was slick with blood, the air thick with smoke, and the noise was a deafening roar that drowned out all commands. The French column was not fighting a battle anymore. It was enduring an execution. The firefight had lasted only minutes, but in the compressed reality of combat, it felt like an eternity. The 52nd had poured volley after volley into the flank of the Imperial Guard, reducing the proud columns of the chasseurs into a heaving, disorganized mob. Yet the French were not yet broken. They were stunned, battered and bleeding, but they were still the Imperial Guard. There was a danger, however slight, that their veteran discipline might reassert itself, that they might form a desperate square or launch a suicidal countercharge that could overwhelm the lighter British line by sheer weight of numbers. Sir John Colborne, watching the carnage through the smoke, understood the precariousness of the moment. Firepower had stunned the beast. Now it was time to kill it. He did not give the French a moment to recover their breath or their wits. He signalled to his officers, and the drums of the 52nd began to beat a new cadence. It was not the stationary rhythm of the firing line, but the urgent, driving pulse of the advance. Colborne raised his sword high and shouted the final command. "Charge!" A transformation swept through the ranks of the Oxfordshire men. For 10 minutes, they had been machines, loading, aiming, firing. Now they became predators. With a unified motion that rippled down the line, over 1,000 soldiers brought their muskets down from the firing position to the charge bayonet. The long triangular steel spikes, 17 inches of cold iron, levelled out in front of them, creating a bristling hedge of metal. Then came the sound. It was not the mechanical boom of gunpowder, but something more primal. The men of the 52nd, releasing the pent-up terror and adrenaline of the day, let out a roar. It was the British huzzah, a guttural, terrifying cheer that rolled across the valley like a shockwave. Slowly at first, then picking up speed, the great red line surged forward across the muddy ground, closing the distance to the French column. To the French soldiers, this was the end of the world. They were already deafened, blinded by smoke and stepping over the bodies of their comrades. Now, through the gloom, they saw the wall of redcoats advancing upon them, the bayonets gleaming wicked and sharp in the twilight. In 18th and 19th century warfare, the bayonet charge was rarely a physical collision. It was a psychological weapon. It was a test of will. One side almost always broke before the steel made contact, and for the first time in the history of the Napoleonic Wars, the Imperial Guard failed the test. The morale of the chasseurs, already fractured by the flank fire, shattered completely. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were unsupported, they were outmaneuvered, and they were about to be skewered. The panic began in the center of the mob and radiated outward like a contagion. Men who had marched to Moscow and back, men who had stood firm at Leipzig and Austerlitz, threw down their muskets. The unit cohesion dissolved. The dense column, which had been a weapon of assault, became a trap. The French soldiers turned their backs on the British and began to push and shove their way to the rear, desperate to escape the approaching wall of spikes. The retreat was not orderly. It was a rout. The French officers, screaming for their men to stand and fight, were swept away by the human tide of panic. As the 52nd pressed their advantage, tramping over the ground where the French flank had stood moments before, a new sound began to rise above the din of the battlefield. It started as a murmur among the French units nearby, then swelled into a cry of absolute despair that echoed from regiment to regiment, all the way back to where Napoleon sat watching on his white mare. "La garde recule! The guard is retreating!" It was a sentence that had never been spoken before on a battlefield. It was an impossibility, a violation of the natural order of things. The Imperial Guard did not retreat. They won, or they died. But the soldiers of the French line infantry saw their elite protectors running for their lives, chased by the bayonets of the 52nd. The sight broke the heart of the French army. Hope evaporated instantly. If the immortals could not stand, then no one could. The panic that started in the valley with Colborne's charge flashed like lightning through the entire French army. The battle was no longer a contest of strategy. It was a race for survival. The 52nd Light Infantry had not just defeated a column, they had broken the spirit of an empire. The disintegration of the Imperial Guard was the catalyst for a catastrophe that rippled outward with terrifying speed. In military terms, the French army had suffered a moral collapse. The psychological contract that binds an army together, the belief that victory is possible and that one's comrades will stand firm, had been voided when the French line infantry, exhausted and demoralized, saw their emperor's chosen protectors running from a single British regiment. The will to fight evaporated instantly. The panic that began in the valley floor did not stay there. It infected the cavalry, the artillery, and the reserves. Entire regiments that had not yet been engaged threw down their weapons and joined the stampede to the rear. High on the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, the Duke of Wellington observed the sudden shift in the battle's temper. Throughout the long day, he had been the embodiment of stoic defense, riding constantly behind his thinning lines, rallying men with a cool, aristocratic detachment. Now, through the parting smoke, he saw the backs of the Imperial Guard. He saw the chaotic mob streaming away from the 52nd Light Infantry. He knew, with the instinct of a commander who had spent a lifetime in war, that the moment of defense had passed. The fulcrum had tipped. Wellington rode to the very edge of the ridge, his figure silhouetted against the darkening sky, visible to the thousands of survivors along the Allied line. He took off his cocked hat and waved it toward the French positions. A simple, silent gesture that carried the weight of a thunderbolt. It was the signal for the general advance. A roar went up from the British line that rivaled the cannon fire of the afternoon. The survivors of the day's carnage, the Scots Greys, the Highlanders, the ragged remnants of the German Legion, surged forward. They left the defensive positions they had held with such desperation for 10 hours and poured down the slope into the valley. But at the spearhead of this great counterstroke, leading the way across the corpse-strewn fields, was still Sir John Colborne and the 52nd. The 52nd had not stopped their advance after breaking the guard. Colborne, sensing that total victory was within grasp, kept his men moving. They crossed the muddy floor of the valley, a landscape that defied description. This was the killing ground where the French cavalry had charged repeatedly earlier in the day. The ground was a quagmire of mud mixed with blood, carpeted with the bodies of men and horses, shattered lances, and abandoned cuirasses. The soldiers of the 52nd had to pick their way over this grisly obstacle course, stepping over the fallen as they pressed the pursuit. As they pushed deeper into the French sector, they encountered the abandoned debris of a broken army. French artillery batteries, which had been pounding the British line for hours, stood silent, their crews having cut the traces of the horses and fled, leaving the guns behind. The 52nd swept past these iron monsters, securing them as trophies of their audacity. They were now operating deep in enemy territory, far ahead of the main Allied line, effectively acting as the vanguard of the entire army. The sun, which had been hidden by smoke and clouds for much of the evening, broke through the gloom for a final, dramatic moment, casting long, golden beams across the scene of the rout. It illuminated a French army in total dissolution. The roads to the south were choked with caissons, wagons, and a frantic mass of humanity trying to escape the vengeance of the British and the approaching Prussians. Yet, amidst the triumph, the danger for the 52nd was not entirely over. In the confusion of the pursuit, isolated pockets of the old guard, the diehards who refused to surrender, formed small squares, fighting to the death to protect the Emperor's retreat. Colborne kept his men under strict control, preventing them from dissolving into a mob of looters or overextending themselves. Even in the intoxication of victory, the discipline of the Oxfordshire Light Infantry held firm. They marched on, not as a rabble, but as a formed unit, a red block of order pushing through a sea of chaos. They had started the day as one regiment among many. They were ending it as the masters of the field. Night began to fall, not with the gradual grace of a summer evening, but with the sudden, suffocating darkness of a storm. The smoke, which had hung low all day, now mingled with the night air to blot out the stars. Yet, the killing did not stop. The 52nd Light Infantry continued their advance, pushing deeper into the French position than any other British unit. They had crossed the valley, ascended the French ridge, and were now marching past the farm of La Belle Alliance, the very headquarters where Napoleon had spent the afternoon mapping out his conquest of Brussels. The regiment was now operating in a chaotic twilight zone. As they pressed forward near the paved road leading to Genappe, dark shapes loomed out of the mist to their left. Muskets were raised and fingers tightened on triggers. A volley flashed in the dark. Friendly fire. It was the vanguard of the Prussian army, General von Zieten's 7th Corps, arriving from the east to seal the French doom. They had mistaken the dark uniforms of the British light infantry for the enemy. Officers on both sides spurred their horses forward, shouting desperately in English and German to cease fire. When the recognition finally dawned, the scene that followed was one of the most surreal of the entire war. The Prussian bands, seeing the redcoats, struck up the anthem, "God Save the King." The exhausted British soldiers, their faces blackened with powder and their uniforms torn, raised a ragged cheer in response. The two great Allied armies had finally linked up. The hammer and anvil strategy had worked, but it was the 52nd that had cleared the path for the hammer to fall. Sir John Colborne, seeing that the Prussians were fresh and eager to continue the pursuit, finally decided to halt his regiment. The 52nd had done enough. They had defeated the Imperial Guard, broken the French centre, and advanced over a mile into enemy territory. Colborne ordered the men to ground arms near the farm of Rossum, south of La Belle Alliance. As the adrenaline of the charge began to fade, the reality of their situation set in. The men collapsed where they stood, dropping into the mud, too exhausted to seek shelter or find food. The physical toll of the battle was immense. They had been on their feet, fighting or marching, for nearly 12 hours. Their mouths were parched black from biting open gunpowder cartridges. Their shoulders were bruised blue from the recoil of their muskets. It was here, in the flickering light of campfires and burning caissons, that the magnitude of the day's cost became visible. The 52nd had suffered heavily, though miraculously less than the units in the centre of the line. But the field behind them was a landscape of horror. Over 40,000 men and 10,000 horses lay dead or wounded within a few square miles. The silence of the night was broken not by the roar of cannons, but by the low, continuous moaning of the wounded, a sound that survivors described as a humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The Duke of Wellington, riding back from his meeting with the Prussian Field Marshal Blücher near La Belle Alliance, passed near the halted 52nd. The Iron Duke, usually so reserved, was visibly moved. He had seen the carnage up close. He knew that the victory had been a near-run thing, saved in the final minutes by the initiative of commanders like Colborne. For the men of the 52nd, lying in the wet rye, there was no grand celebration. There was only the profound, numbing relief of survival. They cleaned their muskets, counted their messmates, and tried to sleep amidst the wreckage of an empire. They had no idea that a controversy was already brewing, a narrative battle that would last far longer than the fighting at Waterloo. They knew what they had done. They knew they had faced the bearsims and broken them. But as history began to be written by the victors in London, the specific heroics of the 52nd were about to be overshadowed by the more politically powerful Guards regiments. The battle was won, but the fight for the truth was just beginning. The sun rose on the morning of June 19th, 1815, illuminating a world that had been irrevocably changed. The great French army, the terror of Europe for 2 decades, had not just been defeated, it had been erased. The roads to Paris were open, and the Napoleonic era was effectively over. But as the smoke cleared from the battlefield of Waterloo, a new fog began to descend, the fog of history, memory, and political manoeuvring. In the immediate aftermath, the Duke of Wellington sat down to write his official dispatch to London. It was a document written in haste, amidst the exhaustion of a commander who had just overseen a slaughter. In his report, the Duke praised the steadfastness of his troops, but his description of the final crisis, the defeat of the Imperial Guard, was vague. He mentioned the Guards, and he mentioned the general advance, but the specific, decisive maneuver of the 52nd Light Infantry was lost in the broad strokes of the narrative. This omission would have lasting consequences. In London, the public and the Prince Regent were hungry for heroes. The narrative that took hold was simple and romantic. The 1st Foot Guards, Maitland's elite regiment, had stood firm and repelled the French giants. In honour of this perceived feat, the 1st Foot Guards were granted a new title, the Grenadier Guards. To this day, they wear the tall bearskin caps that were once the trademark of the French Imperial Guard, a symbolic trophy of their victory. Yet, among the veterans of the Light Division, a quiet bitterness took root. The officers and men of the 52nd knew the truth. They knew that while Maitland's Guards had bravely repulsed the 1st French column, it was the 52nd, and the 52nd alone, that had broken the 2nd, larger column and turned the retreat into a rout. They had the captured French drums, the piles of abandoned French equipment, and the memories of the flank charge to prove it. They had defeated the chasseurs, yet the grenadiers wore the laurels. Sir John Colborne, the architect of the victory, refused to engage in a public war of words. He was a soldier of the old school, believing that duty performed was its own reward. When asked about the battle years later, he would simply point to the facts, to the position of his regiment, and to the testimony of those who were there. He did not seek glory, but he protected the honour of his men. It would take decades, and the meticulous research of historians analysing the terrain and the timing of the battle to fully vindicate the Oxfordshire men. Today, the Waterloo model, a massive diorama constructed by Captain William Siborne in the 1830s based on thousands of veteran testimonies, shows the truth in miniature. There, frozen in time and paint, is the 52nd Light Infantry. They are shown not in the defensive line, but out in the open, wheeled onto the flank of the French column, the gate swinging shut on Napoleon's empire. The legacy of the 52nd's charge is more than just a dispute over regimental honours. It is a testament to the power of initiative. In an era where soldiers were expected to be mindless automatons, obeying orders without question, the Battle of Waterloo was decided by a colonel who acted without orders, and a regiment that possessed the discipline to execute a complex manoeuvre in the chaos of Armageddon. They proved that the rigid lines of 18th century warfare were evolving, and that a well-trained, flexible unit could achieve results disproportionate to its size. As the years passed, the wheat grew tall again in the fields of Belgium, hiding the scars of the artillery and the graves of the fallen. The great mound of the Lion of Waterloo was constructed, altering the landscape forever. But for those who study the military art, the defining image of the battle remains that singular moment in the twilight. 1,000 men in faded red coats, stepping out of the line, pivoting into the smoke, and charging into history. They were the forgotten victors, the men who broke the old guard, and in doing so, broke the chains of a continent. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.